Welcome to Freeport, which is, I would say, probably the largest city in Norrath, with some caveats. Now, when I was thinking about doing a tour of Freeport, I zoomed out. I started to think about where Freeport sits in the pantheon of Norrathian cities. And that got me thinking about all these ages. If you look into Norrath history, EverQuest history, you'll see it's kind of divided up into all these different ages. Kind of like human history in real life. We talk about like the Bronze Age, the Gilded Age, Dark Ages. We've got all these terms to describe different eras because these eras were so different, and Norrath is the same way. If you look at the timeline of Norrath history, you've got the Dragon Age, not to be confused with the game of the same name. You've got like the Shisar Age, the Elven Age, all these different ages in Norrath. And I started thinking, well, what age are we in right now? When you look at the lore of a game, you often think about the past. Where were we? How did we get here? But we don't often think about, well, what's going on right now? What's the lore right now? At least I don't. I tend to associate lore with past. And when I thought about where we are right now, and by now I mean when the game came out. So I'm on Project 1999 Green, which is a progression server. We're up to Kunark. I'm talking about when the game came out, and I'm not talking about March of 99. I'm talking about in the timeline of Norrath history, the point at which there are basically 3 continents that are known to most races, which are Thaydor, Antonica, Otis. Where are we? How do we get here? The more that I thought about whether or not Freeport is the largest city in Norrath, I thought about, well, okay, what are some of the other largest cities? And Norrath obviously comes to mind because Norrath and Freeport are the only 2 3-zone cities. And the number of zones is one factor when I was trying to think about, well, what are the biggest cities in Norrath? But I also thought about how much foot traffic is there, both PC and NPC. And I think Freeport clearly takes the cake in that one. And I thought about how big does the city feel? Like when you run around, do you see a lot of shops, a lot of buildings, a lot of homes? And I think that 2 cities do a really good job of that. And I will say Norrath does do a good job of that. But I actually think that Freeport and Quanos do the best job of that. And yes, I say Quanos. If you think I'm pronouncing that wrong, maybe I am. But I've been saying it wrong for 20 years. So it's hard to correct. Bear with me on that. Quanos does a really good job of making it feel like a real lived-in city. And Quanos, if you don't know the game, Quanos is the other human city. You've got Freeport on the eastern side of Antonica, which is the largest continent in the game. Again, with the caveat, up to the point that the game is at launch. And you've got Quanos on the west side, west coast, you could say. And you've actually got another big human city right smack in the middle of those 2 other huge cities. You've got High Pass / High Keep. And that one actually has a date on it that says when it was established. And when you do /time in EverQuest, you get 2 numbers. You get the Earth time. I like how they call it Earth time, which is pulled from your computer, I assume, including the time zone. And then you've also got the Norrath time, which a lot of people only look at this number here, the hour and the AM PM. Probably because if it's nighttime, you want to figure out, like if you're camping the ancient Cyclops or other mobs that spawn at certain times of the day, or if you're just a human and you're night blind, you want to figure out when that is a lot of orcs. You want to figure out when it's not going to be night anymore so you can see a damn thing in front of you, like a bunch of orcs. But that time, A, helps us figure out how long ago High Keep was established, and B, it tells you kind of where you are in Norrath history, which is one of the things that got me thinking about the timeline. Now, let's think about that. We got the largest continent in the game. We've got 3 of the biggest cities, if not the 3 biggest, although I would say Norrath is... All 3 cities plus Norrath are definitely in the top 5. And I thought about, okay, based on using /time and what it says on High Keep, when it was established, and we have all these ages, what age are we in right now? And I think we're in the human age in Norrathian history. The age when humans are the most influential, maybe you could say the most powerful race in Norrath. Here's why I say that. 3 of the 5 largest cities in the game are human cities. That doesn't mean they're only humans occupying them, but it means that humans are the ones that run the city, and they are the majority population. These 3 cities are in very different climates. So Qeynos is kind of your typical temperate, moderate climate with, whatever they call it, residual forest type. That's what it appears to be. I don't even know if residual is the right word, but just kind of in real world, like a East Coast type of climate. And then you've got Freeport, which is in a desert, which is really interesting, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you've got Highkeep, which is literally built into the mountains, where there is some sort of mountainous pass right down the middle of the continent. Now, on top of that, you've got 4 ports in Norrath. Ports where boats can, trade and travel and all that kind of stuff. 3 of the 4 are controlled by humans. 1 is controlled by dwarves. That also comes with a caveat. 1 of those is on Otis, and it is controlled by the Erudites. I believe that it's fair game to umbrella both Erudites and barbarians under the human sort of umbrella of they're sort of sub-races. Yes, they're technically different from humans in a lot of physical and mental characteristics, but they're also probably different because they've isolated themselves geographically for so long. And that's one of the characteristics of humans that makes them unique from the other races, I believe. You could argue that Wood Elves and High Elves might have been the same way, but I don't think those races formed the same way. I think Tuner made those races unique on purpose. It's not like the humans, where by isolating themselves geographically for so long, they became different races. But I really don't think anyone would argue that barbarians and Erudites don't fall under the umbrella of humans. Now, it's interesting because when you look at the starting stats of a human in this game, everything is kind of right down the middle. Nothing's great, no matter which class you pick. This guy must be carrying a ton of plat. Nothing's really that exceptional. None of the stats are. Then you look at the Erudites. There are some exceptional stats there, mostly intelligence, and then to some extent wisdom, though not as much as intelligence. Yet they're weaker, they're frailer. Barbarians are the opposite. They've got stronger, physical characteristics, but they suffer a bit on the mental. And that's really interesting because it's almost like you've got this base race of humans. Then you've got a group of humans that, I guess you could say, interbred themselves, that were more focused on the height, the strength, less focused on the magic, the intellect, the wisdom. And then you've got this other group that did the opposite. And through, I guess you could call it interbreeding, although who knows how large these groups were, they sort of specialized in those stats, but your base humans, which do outnumber barbarians and Erudites in the world of Norrath, still have those generic stats. Now, going back to the power thing, so that's how I explain the port thing. I say 3 out of the 4 ports. If you control 3 out of the 4 ports that exist... Oh, there's a barbarian. And I'm not counting high elves, half elves. If you control 3 out of the 4 ports, that's power. That is serious power in a world that heavily relies on trade. And that's another interesting aspect of humans. If you go through the various ages of Norrath and you look at that lore, it almost always comes down to power. Well, why was it called the Dragon Age? Well, because the dragons were dominating all the other... Well, there weren't really any other races in Norrath when the dragons first appeared, but why was it called the Shissar Age? Because the Shissar were dominating all the other races that they came upon, including, to some extent, the gods themselves. Why was it called the Elven Age? Same deal. The elves were the strongest and most powerful race for a certain stretch of time. Now, if this is to be considered the human age, that's not really how humans are doing it. Which is why I sort of struggled by saying powerful, because really influence was the word that is most accurate. Humans have achieved this level of influence without having to do it through physical dominance of the other races. And that is unique in Norrath history. If you look at a city like Freeport, it's very trade focused. And you do see other races like ogres. You see an ogre here. You see a troll in Highkeep. And yes, I know I'm cherry picking examples, but it shows you that humans, unlike most other races in Norrath, are very much open to the idea of accepting other races as long as they're willing to play by the rules that they've established. And when I say humans dominated, when I talk about dominating other races, that is what the other races tended to do during their quote-unquote age of power. But humans are doing it in a way where it's sort of this economic might that they have. I mean, look at Freeport. Look at the name Freeport. Free port. It's a port where you go to trade, to buy, to sell. And boats are one of the mechanisms. If you look at the lore of Freeport, that is supposedly how it started. It started as just this trading outpost that grew and grew and grew. High Keep is kind of the same deal without a port. Quenos, same deal. Port is a big, the dock and all that stuff is a big part of that zone. I find it really interesting that humans have become so powerful when physically they're far from the most powerful race on Norrath. Far from it. In fact, going back to the isolated sub-race of barbarians, they're stronger than humans, but they don't have nearly the power or influence that humans do. Humans have also managed to expand their empire across the entirety of Antonica, from left to right, east to west, I should say, through those 3 huge cities without being physically dominant. And not only have they expanded their influence to those regions in between the extremes of Quenos and Freeport, but they've also made it safe in between, and safe for other races, again, if they're willing to play by the rules. And on top of that, there's really only 2 races in the game that aren't welcome in human cities. 2.5, let's say. And those would be trolls and ogres. And that's probably because those 2 races are, ironically, because they're not barbarians, but those 2 races are the most barbaric of all the races. They can't play by the rules. They do have to kill and eat everything in sight. And yes, I'm stereotyping, but this game relies heavily on racial stereotypes within the sort of realm of races that they've created. So the other super evil race that, and again, this is pre-Kunuk, so I'm not talking about Ixar. The other evil race, Dark Elves, this is where the half comes in. Dark Elves are welcome in Freeport for the most part, and it sort of depends on their class. Like Necros and Shadow Knights, maybe not so welcome in North Freeport, but otherwise pretty much welcome to Freeport. I don't think Dark Elves really, maybe if they're agnostic, but I don't think Dark Elves are welcome in Quenos, and I think High Keep is kind of the same way as Quenos. It's more along the Quenos lines. But still, that is a sign, the fact that so many races have good relations with humans, that's a sign of A, their influence, and B, the way that they do their influence. They clearly don't have a good relationship with halflings because they physically dominate the halflings. It's because they've made peace with every race on Norrath, except for trolls and ogres, which are really hard to make peace with. No offense to them. Now, you really can't find an example throughout the history of Norrath where a race has made such good inroads, extended the olive branch to so many of the other races. Now, I am just talking about playable races, because obviously the humans are not on good terms with orcs or gnolls or goblins, right? And that's fine. No one is, right? But everyone else they've made good relations with, including the Dark Elves in the case of Freeport, and that's really hard to do. Now, you could say, oh, well, the Dark Elves are taking advantage of the humans. You could say the same thing about a lot of the other races. They probably, I mean, you could make the argument that the only reason that, say, the High Elves aren't dominating Norrath the way that humans appear to be is because they just don't want to, or they don't see the value in it. They're above it, right? They're High Elves. It's beneath them to exert their dominance on other races. Well, okay, maybe, but meanwhile, the humans are doing it. They are extending their influence across Antonica. They have even extended their influence beyond just the cities. Now, I don't count Sherfall Glade as a city. It's sort of, this is a weird term, but sort of a suburb of Quenos. And you could argue that's the third part of Quenos that makes it the third zone. I don't know. I wouldn't really say that, but it kind of feels that way. But if you go out into you go further than just the cities. You go into not just Quenos Hills, but you go into West Corona. You go into North Corona. You go into South Corona. You go into East Corona. You go into the Commonlands, East and West. You go into the desert, Oasis, North Row. There's humans. They're in all of them. They're all over the place. The human influence from Quenos to High Keep is constant. You've got humans in every single one of those zones leading up to High Keep. But if you're running from Quenos to High Keep, they've extended their influence in a way, like if you look at North Corona or even West Corona, where they're making that zone safer, not just for them, but for all the races that they have some sort of allyship with. Not even an ally, just good relations. That is unprecedented in Norrath history. It's amazing. Like, you feel somewhat safer in North Corona because there are human guards there. Now, yes, famously the guards will get killed by hill giants. I think they can kill griffins, probably not the named one in North Corona, but whatever. I mean, those are extremes. The point is, they're trying. They're trying to make those zones safer. I'm talking from a lore perspective. I mean, yes, as a player, you do feel safer if you can run your Highland Lion to a guard or your Griffon. But if you look at it from a lore perspective and not just your day-to-day XP grind, this is an example of a race spending resources, both human resources, but also armor. You know, they're sacrificing having more guards in their cities to try and make these outskirts, these dangerous places, safer. And you kind of get the impression that if they could, they would keep going. They would try to make more of the world safe, you know? You can only do that so much without bumping into some of the other races like trolls and ogres. But my point is, they have made those zones feel safer in a variety of ways. They built a bridge, a physical bridge, between North and South Corona. You don't need the bridge, the water isn't that deep, but it's just a sign of not only their power, but their ability to get things done. And that's really the story of the human race in this game. They've managed to get so much done. They created not just these cities out of nowhere, but look at this city. This is a city in a desert. That's really hard to build a city in a desert. Just look at human history. How many big cities have emerged in deserts throughout history, right? Like, I'm not just talking about like Dubai or whatever in recent centuries, but like throughout human history, surviving in a desert is something that's really hard. Now, I know that that's kind of an extreme example, but I really think the developers did this as a way of highlighting the idea that humans are survivors. They take a situation that seems really difficult to thrive in, and they somehow manage to thrive in it. Like a desert, building the largest city in Norrath in a desert. Look at the barbarians. They're in Hallis, which is a cold, snowy atmosphere. And they've done it when a lot of races I really just don't see high elves being like, you know what, let's make a city in the frozen tundra. Now, you're obviously not going to like that example if you don't agree with me that barbarians are just a subgroup of humans. And I don't say sub to mean lower, I just mean like humans are sort of what everything stems from as far as barbarians and Eurydites. Meaning they were once humans and they've sort of become their own thing. You've got human guards in dangerous zones like East Corona, willing to sacrifice themselves to try and make it a safer place for travelers, which is fascinating. You've got settlements in East Corona, settlements of humans that are trying to eke out a living in a place that is uncivilized. It's dangerous. I mean, there's cyclopses walking around, there's lions, there's poisonous spiders, there's undead gnolls, and yet humans are trying to eke out a living there, whereas I think a lot of the other civilized races would be like, screw that, I'm not trying to live in freaking East Corona, it's dangerous as hell, I'm not going there. Humans have this innate desire to tackle those types of challenges, and they've done it. Those humans aren't living, the sweet life in East Corona, but they're trying, and that's something that you can't really say about a lot of these other races. I mean, you can find a camp of dark elves in, far away from where they live, like in Fedor. But that's not because they're trying to make a city there. That's because they're trying to screw with the high elves and the wood elves. And they're trying to set something up to, like I said, screw with them. And same, I mean, you can find that little troll guard tower in Wrath Mountains. That's not even that far from where they're from, but okay, I mean, that counts as an example. But you won't find it to the same extent, not nearly to the same extent as you will with humans. Humans have even managed to take the largest continent in the world, the known world, let's call it, and they renamed it. It was originally called Tunaria, obviously named after Tuner. They renamed it after a human, Antonius Bale. Antonica. It's called Antonica, named after Antonius Bale. And they managed to get most of the rest of the world to go along with it and call it Antonica. You know, the dwarves are calling it Antonica, and the gnomes and the ogres and the trolls, they all call it Antonica. And even the elves, for most part, I'm sure, acknowledge that it's Antonica. They probably say something, I mean, they probably are snooty about it and say, oh, whatever, the humans call it Antonica, but we know it's Tunaria. But they acknowledge that, all the races acknowledge, this is Antonica, this is what the humans have done. They've renamed it. They're the primary, the most influential power structure on the continent, whatever. It's Antonica. We'll go along with it. And that's incredible. They've taken all these zones that are dangerous and they've managed to facilitate commerce in those zones because that's how they extend their influence. They've managed to create peace and order in a world that was pretty brutal. And they've done it without having to rely exclusively on the use of brute force. They've established harmonious relationships with every race except the trolls and ogres, and that is just incredible. So, if you don't agree with me that we are currently living in the human age of Norrath, what else could you say we're living in? Quanos, Freeport, Highkeep, all the various places in between, even places like Oasis or Wrath Mountains, you'll see humans there. Yeah, and sometimes they're gypsies or they're bandits or whatever, like you'll see those, but they're still doing it. They're still there. They're still eking out a living there. And they're humans. They've really dominated the most important continent in the world, in Norrath, that we know of as of when the game came out. And that is just an example of their power. Now, the interesting thing about the humans that I thought about as well is that I don't really know who created the humans. Like when I look at this high elf, obviously that was created by Tuner. When you look at a lot of races, like the dwarves, Brelsarillis, the gnomes, Brelsarillis, the halflings, Bristlebane, the dark elves, Norrath. You know who created most of these races. I don't know that Nathaniel Marr was the exclusive creator of the human race. I don't really know who created the human race. The point is, if the fact that we don't know who created them, all these other races are so tied to their god that created them. They're almost enslaved by this notion that, hey, I was created by Tuner. I have to keep that in my mind at all times. Humans are free from that. Now you can argue, oh, well, in North Freeport, they're super dedicated to Nathaniel Marr and Arolisi Marr, and in Quanos, they're super dedicated. I can find a group of humans that's super dedicated to Quellius, or however you say it, and Rodset Knife. Yes, but not all humans are. In fact, most aren't. And on top of that, this is an interesting little nugget of lore from the character selection screen, character creation screen. If you pick any race, just say wood elves, you have very few choices of gods. Ogres, very few choices. You're talking 3 at most, a handful. How about halflings? Couple choices. Gnomes are okay. I'll get to gnomes in a second. Dwarves, couple choices. Now go to human. You have a ton of choices. You have more choices than any other race. This is because humans are so removed from the notion of, hey, we were created by this god, therefore we exist to serve this god. And maybe not having that in the back of your mind all the time, the way that the elves and the dwarves and all them do, sort of frees you up to pursue other interests. The one interesting exception is the gnomes. They are the only race that seem to be capable of worshiping another god that didn't create them, and that their primary city does not condone. Okay, so the same way that humans in Quanos can worship Protoxos, but they kind of got to do it underground. Well, gnomes do the same thing with Protoxos, in fact. I mean, hell. Where'd it go? I follow Protoxos, as we all know. Pointed out all the time. I even went and said hello to him a few videos ago. Okay, so humans are the only other race, because you see it in Freeport. I guess you sort of see it in High Keep. I mean, there is definitely some... Not everyone in High Keep is on the same page, it's safe to say, about the right way to live and probably the right god to worship. And that brings us to what you might say is both all of this, the ability to worship whatever god you want as a human, with the exception of Khazak-Dul. They can't follow Khazak-Dul from what I can tell. No class can. But they have a wider variety of choices of race, of deity than any other race. It seems to come with the con of there is a lot of interfeuding between the humans. Freeport is a city divided. I'll talk about that when I do the tour. Quenos, city divided. High Keep, I just talked about it. That's a city divided. Humans are more divided than any other race. It's fair to say that. And that is perhaps a fatal flaw. And if you look at all these ages, they all ended for one reason or another. There was always a fatal flaw that brought them down, and maybe that'll be the case with humans. Although we can sort of look ahead in Norrathian history. Really, so I stopped playing the game. The last expansion that came out when I was still playing was Omens of War, but I barely even saw scratch the surface of that one. But if we I don't know what happened after that, so I'm not going to acknowledge anything that happened after that. But if we just look at launch to, I guess, Omens of War, I'll use that as the endpoint. You could make the argument, I would say, there were only 2 major events that happened in the timeline that were lore, that were impactful. I would say the Awakening of the Sleeper and the killing of Quarm, which opened up the, whatever they called it, that basically led to the Gates of Discord Continent, or expansion, as well as Omens of War, which allowed, I guess the theory is, or the lore is, that the gods, having been either killed by humans or just saying, you know what, if these are not humans, players, if these players are going to just rape and pillage our planes and us, screw it, we're not going to protect them anymore. We're going to open them up to outside voids or whatever. I don't know. If you played long enough, you probably remember that little bit of lore. I think the game really went off the rails later on, lore-wise, but that's another story. I don't think humans ever really lose their influence, but that doesn't really matter because you really have to, if you want to look at the lore of the game, you got to look at it at launch and maybe the first couple expansions to figure out sort of what's going on, where are we headed, who's, So, Freeport, I would say, is the largest city in Norrath and the most important city in Norrath. And now we'll dive into a tour.